All right, what's going on, everyone? So recently I had swapped out my Generation 1 up-down air unit for Generation 2, and I was hoping that it would be a little bit better, a little faster, and more even as far as the tire pressures go, but I don't think that the Gen 2 has solved that problem yet. Now, using the up-down air system is pretty easy. You have a main control unit and it has a line going to each tire, and then you can hook up your individual tire whips from there, so that way you can air up and air down all of your tires at once. Now, the issue I ran into with the Generation 1 unit is that the tire inflation times were a little bit longer than I was expecting. Now, it is convenient being able to hook everything up and then walk off, but because I think it was using a 1/4-inch line, it was taking longer to fill up my tires because it couldn't quite fill all of them up at the same time just because of that airline restriction. Now, the Generation 2 up-down air unit features 3/8-inch airlines, so they're quite a bit larger, and that's throughout the entire system. So I was thinking that it might have sped things up, but it really didn't, and I ultimately think it's actually the tire whips that are causing the problem. Now, typically Schrader valves are used, of course, on all of your tires. It's a standard hookup or air chuck connection. However, they're not a very fast connection, and I think when we add in another extra Schrader valve connection, it really slows things down. Now, before I was thinking that maybe it was the 1/4-inch line that was causing a problem. However, even if you just take off one side of your air whip basically and you plug it in and you hook it up to the tire so air will flow out freely, it doesn't come out that quickly. Now, with the Generation 1 up-down air unit, I very quickly realized that I wanted to be using an alternative method than the tire whips for airing down because it was taking so long. So I did switch over to using Coyote deflators. Now, the Coyote deflators screw directly onto the valve stem itself of the tire, and you can drive while they are airing your tires down. And of course, if you have air whips connected, then you're not going to be able to drive. So one of the issues, of course, with the up-down air system is being able to air down your tires when you get somewhere, and I felt like it was taking too long using the tire whip system itself, all running out of the main control center valve here. Now, another problem that I noticed using these air whips is I feel like they're kind of chewing up my tire valve stems. It's not that big of a deal, but I noticed if I had a metal air cap, trying to screw it onto the threads of the tire stem was kind of difficult. And upon closer look, you could see that some of the threads were kind of messed up. And I think it's from this unit when you push it on, basically. The other items that I have either screw on to inflate the tire or has a quick release, so you kind of pop it on and then you push the lever down and it locks into place. And with these, I think it is chewing up the valve stems. The next issue that I have with the up-down air system is airing tires up. Now, it seems like a good idea having your main control panel here and hooking up all of your tires together. It gives even pressures. However, it's pretty slow. And again, that goes back to the Schrader valves. I think because you're now using a Schrader valve here and at the tire, your actual airflow going into the tire is probably pretty slow, and it's certainly slower than if you were just using a regular connection straight onto the tire instead of having two quick connections from the tire whips. Now, my last issue with the up-down air system is the tire pressures themselves. Now, the control panel, you have a little valve here so you can adjust your pressures up or down depending on what you need to do when you're filling them up. However, as you get close to your cutoff, so if you set the regulator to 35 psi, as you get close to 35, it starts pulsing the air compressor on and off. Now, the reason it does that is as you get closer to the max pressure that you have set on your regulator, it slows down the airflow coming out of the air compressor. Now, when the air compressor reaches a certain pressure, whatever your cutoff switch is, it will shut off. So when that happens, it shuts off the air compressor, and then the tires and the air lines basically start regulating a little bit, and then more airflow comes out of the regulator valve, and then your compressor has to kick on. Now, when it does this, it pulses on, turns off, turns on, turns off. So that's not very good for your compressor, of course, to be turning on and off like that, not to mention it's kind of annoying. Now, when you're doing that and you're filling up your tires, they're not actually filling up evenly. Now, I know it's going to be off by, a little bit here and there, a couple PSI, but it's been off as much as 6 PSI between the different tires. And so that's annoying when I hook up, I fill up all the tires and I'm driving down the road, and by the time the TPMS sensors and everything figure out the actual pressure in the tires, my pressures are all over, and it's not like the front is, one pressure and the back is different. Like the front right will be lower than the front left, and then the rear tires will be off by at least 3 or 4 PSI from each other. And then the largest discrepancy in pressure I've had is about 6 PSI between one of the front tires and one of the rear tires. Now, the whole point of using the up-down air system is being able to easily air up and air down. However, unfortunately for this, you do get overland points, of course, for having a system like this, but the actual functionality of it is not that good. Now, I was really hoping that the Generation 2 up-down air unit would solve some of the problems that I was running into with the Generation 1. However, this still does not fix the problems, and I really do think it's probably from the tire whips and the quick connections on there by adding a secondary Schrader valve at each tire. Now, I know I've talked a lot about this now, so let's go ahead and I'll show you an example basically of airing up and airing down the tires. Now, I had to split filming into 2 different days to make sure that I could show you both situations that I've run into with the up-down air unit. So the first one is going to be using the regulator on there, which is how the system is designed. So I will be setting it at 35 PSI, and then we'll turn the compressor on and let it run. I've got the truck running and I've got my pressure set at 35 PSI, so let's flip on our compressor. All right, so right there you just saw the compressor runs fast enough to where the regulator cannot let enough airflow into the tires at the same time. So the lines for the compressor fill up and it hits the 150 or 140 PSI cutoff, and that tells the compressor to shut off. And then as air goes into the tires more, then that pressure bleeds off and the compressor turns back on, and it turns into this real vicious cycle. So I'm gonna go ahead and flip the valve for the tank here, and what that will do is allow excess pressure that does not go into the tires to go into the tank instead, so that way we're not pulsing our compressor on and off. It will, of course, add to our air up times. Now, in my experience under timing, for this compressor, it takes about 1.5 minutes to fill up my air tank in the back. And so at most, it should be adding 1.5 minutes to our overall fill up times. And you could even hear a change in the air compressor as well, because now it's not having to build as much pressure because our tank is now taking over that excess pressure that is not making it into our tires. All right, now I want to give a quick update. We're at just over 4 minutes now, and the compressor is shut off, and that's because the tank in the back is filled up. Now the Extreme Alpac Magnum compressor is really, really powerful and fast, so I'm not too surprised by that. And there we go, it just kicked on again. But that kind of gives you an idea that there's a lot of airflow capable from this system, but it's just not going into the tires fast enough. Once we get to the 5-minute mark, I'm gonna go ahead and stop it, and then that way we can take a look and we'll check our tire pressures to see what we're at after 5 minutes with the regulator set at 35 PSI. And I started at 15 PSI in all of the tires when this test started. And 5 minutes. Now, in a way, by doing this, in fact, I'm gonna close that valve. Now, in a way, once that air tank hits 150 PSI, just because the compressor shuts off doesn't mean airflow isn't going from the tank into the tires. So in the meantime, while I take measurements, I did close off the tank, and that's to make sure that the pressure that we built up in that tank is not gonna be bleeding into the tires while I'm taking measurements. So like I said, let me take measurements here. We're at the 5-minute mark, and we started at 15 PSI. So this is the front passenger side, and we're at 20 PSI. So in 5 minutes, we've gone up 5 PSI. That's 1 PSI per minute, which is really bad, and the compressor is capable of so much more. So the regulator is definitely slowing us down, but let me walk around here and we'll check the other pressure. This is the back right, and same thing, we started at 15 PSI, and this one's at 24 PSI. So go figure on that one, that's 2 PSI a minute. Driver's rear tire at 25 PSI, and the driver's front (26 PSI). So that means the tire that is closest to the regulator is the lowest pressure, which is kind of confusing. So yeah, but anyway, we'll continue on with the test. I'll hook up all the tires again and we'll start going. And now approaching the 9-minute mark. And as we can see, the compressor has shut off because our tank is filled up. So again, let's go ahead and take a look at the air pressures. 23 PSI, wow. 28 PSI for the right rear. Left rear, where are we at? 29 PSI, and the front driver's 30 PSI. So again, you can see pressures are off. Again, that was at the 9-minute mark, and we're gonna keep going and eventually get to 35. So now we're at 12 minutes, so let's take our pressures. Front passenger. Oh wow, 24 PSI on our way. 30.5 for the back right. And driver's side rear. We're at 31. And driver front. 31.5. So let's keep going. All right, so as we approach the 15-minute mark, I'm just gonna call it where it's at, and we'll take pressure, see where we're at, and we'll move on to the next test. All right, valve closed, and like I said, wherever the pressures are at are where they're gonna be at. Now, the other thing is, as we got past about the 13-minute mark, the compressor wasn't running very much, and that's because the air tank was already filled up, and airflow from the tank through the regulator on the UpdownAir unit is so slow that the compressor didn't need to turn on that much. So disappointing, and I don't have high hopes for my pressures being too accurate, but let's go ahead and take a look. Front passenger, 26 PSI. Rear passenger is 32.5. Driver's rear, 32.5, so at least the back two match. And the front driver, 32.5. So 3 out of the 4 tires were the same. This is the problem I run into frequently. Normally, the front passenger and one of the back ones is off by like 5 or 6 PSI. And so that's really frustrating when you're just trying to set your pressures and go. The system is supposed to make it nice and easy and convenient, and it seems like a good idea, but it just doesn't work that well. Plus, that means you're sitting there idling for 15 minutes and my tire pressures still aren't accurate. Now, when I was using my smaller OB2 compressor, I just thought it was the size of the compressor. I didn't realize it's the system that was actually slowing me down, because this compressor here is capable of filling up these tires way faster than that. So the next test that we're gonna be doing here, I'm gonna turn the regulator all the way up, so maximum pressure that it will let through. Now the gauge only goes up to like 90 or 100 PSI. I don't know if more pressure can go through that. However, we'll just have it maxed out basically and hook up all the tires. I will drop back down to 15 PSI again, and we'll run the same test and see how much faster it is. And that will let us know, of course, how much the regulator is slowing us down. I've got my airlines hooked up. I'm back to 15 PSI in all of the tires here, and we'll go and start the truck and start the compressor. Now, I have found in my experience with the fully open like this, I should not need to have the air tank needed or accessible basically, because the regulator should be letting enough airflow into the tires. Of course, doing this kind of defeats the whole purpose of having that regulator and having a pressure that you just set, and the truck, and everything stops when we get to that point. But we're really just trying to figure out where the bottleneck is in the setup, and I'm pretty sure it's mainly the regulator. So we are now at the 5-minute mark, and let's take a look, see what our pressures are. And this again is with the system maxed out. All right, and front passenger, 26 PSI, which is a huge jump. Before, I think we were at about 20 last time. And the back tires, see if they are higher or not. 27.5, okay, so that's a lot closer than I think we were before as far as the pressure differences. And the rear driver, 29.5, interesting. And the front driver, 30.5. So we can tell already that the regulator was really slowing us down before. We're at the 5-minute mark, and our pressures are already significantly higher than they were when we had the regulator set at 35 PSI at the 5-minute mark. So we're gonna go ahead and plug this in and keep going. All right, now since our pressures were quite a bit higher at 5 minutes, I'm gonna be checking at 8 rather than 10 like I did before. So let's check that out. All right, front passenger. 31.5, all right. Rear passenger. 35 PSI, hey, we finally got there. And rear driver, 37 PSI. All right, and front driver. Whoa, 38.5. All right, well, there we have it. It's obvious that the regulator here is one of the bigger issues for the UpdownAir system. At the 8-minute mark, we're pretty much at where our pressures should be. We still ran into that problem where the pressures are different. We have 31 in the front right, but the driver's side is at like 38.5. So pretty big difference there. I expect, you know, a PSI or two. But to have that big of a discrepancy is not really useful when you're out on the trails and you end up having to babysit your system while you're airing up your tires, which defeats the whole purpose of the UpdownAir unit. Now, had I done this test and we had it cranked fully and the pressures were pretty close, then I'd say maybe the system has kind of, you know, some merit to it because, all right, you know, just set it full blast for 5 or 6 minutes and then slow it down towards the end. But as we can see here, the pressure differences are still off by quite a bit. And that just doesn't work that well. And even if you leave the lines hooked up to the tires, because the airflow from the Schrader valves is so low, it really takes a long time for the pressures to equalize. And so, I mean, maybe you sat there for like 30 minutes, they would all even out. But, you know, even sitting there for up to 5 minutes while I was, you know, grabbing food or whatever, the pressures were still off by quite a bit and they never equalized between all of the tires. Now, I was really looking forward to using the new UpdownAir unit, the Gen 2. I thought it would have some better features and decrease time for inflating my tires, and it turns out that just isn't the case here. Now, I do have a new system that I've been using after my frustration with the UpdownAir unit, and basically it only does one tire at a time, but it's very, very accurate. It is an all digital system, so basically you set the pressure, hook it up to your tire, and it will inflate and then stop when it is supposed to, and it actually stops at the proper pressure, and it doesn't matter what pressure you're setting it at. The speed basically is the same. It's not like it'll go slower at a lower PSI and faster at a higher. It just inflates and, of course, checks the pressure every once in a while and then beeps when it's done. So that's super convenient. I will have that coming out in the next video. Also coming up is going to be my test with the Extreme Outback Magnum compressor for filling up the tires, so that way we can see the actual times that it's taking to inflate. I will give you a hint, it is very fast and really awesome to be using. And of course, don't forget to like the channel and subscribe. And if you have any questions or comments, put those down below, and we'll see you in the next video.